Hey guys, tonight we are going on a journey to a place where logic took a brief but spectacular holiday. We're heading to the 17th-century Netherlands, a world of incredible wealth, groundbreaking art, and a nationwide obsession with a single flower that became so intense it caused one of the most famous financial bubbles in history. Yes, we are going to a time and place where a single flower bulb could literally be worth more than a grand house. It's a story that is both beautiful and utterly absurd. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go ahead and drop a comment below with your city and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is the quality of the light. It's a soft, silvery, moisture-minus, heavy light that seems to make everything glow from within. The air smells of salt, wet stone, and faint heat of spices from a faraway land. You're standing on a cobblestone street next to a canal. Its dark water reflecting the tall, narrow, gabled houses that are packed shoulder to minus shoulder along its edge. This is the Dutch Republic in its golden age. You are in the heart of a global economic powerhouse. The tiny Dutch Republic, with its handful of provinces, has become the richest, most prosperous nation on earth. You can see it everywhere. The canals are choked with boats and barges, piled high with goods. In the distance, you can see the masts of massive ocean liners going ships that have just returned from the East Indies, their hulls filled with treasures. This isn't a kingdom ruled by a flamboyant king and a hereditary aristocracy. This is a republic run by merchants, bankers, and ship captains. This is the key historical fact you need to grasp. The society here is fundamentally different. Power and status are not determined by ancient bloodlines, but by wealth, and it is new money, earned through hard work, clever investment, and a healthy appetite for risk. These men in their sober, expensive black coats and starched white ruffs are the new kings, and they are intensely proud of what they have built. You wander through the city. It's remarkably clean and orderly. The brickwork on the houses is immaculate. You see women scrubbing their own stoops with a kind of fierce dedication. There's an air of sober, God-fearing industry about the place. And then you realize something fundamental about the very ground beneath your feet. It shouldn't be here. Much of the Netherlands is land that has been painstakingly reclaimed from the sea. For centuries, the Dutch have been engaged in a colossal struggle against water, building dikes, draining lakes, and creating new farmland polders with the iconic power of their windmills. This is our weirdly fascinating detail for the day this culture has a unique relationship with nature. Nature is not a wild, romantic force to be admired. It is an adversary to be tamed, an unruly element to be ordered, controlled, and improved upon. A Dutchman's garden isn't just a patch of land with flowers. It's a small, perfect symbol of humanity's triumph over the chaotic sea. This mindset is crucial. These are people who believe in their own ability to create order and value out of chaos. They have literally created their own country. Why not create their own economy out of thin air, too? Historians have debated for centuries about the secret to this tiny nation's explosive success. What made the Dutch Golden Age possible? One famous theory, put forth by the sociologist Max Weber, points to the Protestant work ethic. He argued that the dominant Calvinist faith, with its emphasis on hard work, frugality, and worldly success as a potential sign of God's favor, created a population of hyper-motivated entrepreneurs. But other historians argue it was more about practical advantages, superior shipbuilding technology, the invention of joint minor stock companies, a central geographic location for trade, and an influx of skilled refugees from other parts of Europe. The debate continues to this day. Was it God or good bookkeeping that made them rich? Looking around at the bustling, confident, and slightly smug city, you suspect it's a bit of both. This is a society flush with cash, run by a new class of merchants desperate for new ways to show off their wealth. It's a culture that believes in its own ingenuity and its right to impose order on the natural world. It is the perfect, fertile ground for an obsession to take root. All it needs is a seed, and that seed is about to arrive. A strange and exotic passenger on one of those tall ships. A splash of impossible color about to land in this world of sober black and gray. The bustling canal minus side scene recedes, and you find yourself in a quieter, more contemplative space. It's a garden, but it's not the kind of wild, rambling garden you might find in England. This is a Dutch garden, small, enclosed by a brick wall, and meticulously, almost obsessively, neat. The flower beds are laid out in perfect geometric patterns. Every plant is in its place. It is a miniature, controlled world. But today, there is a new addition to this orderly paradise, an object of intense curiosity. In the center of a carefully prepared bed, a single, strange flower is in bloom. It's unlike anything you've ever seen in a European garden. The local flowers, roses, lilies, carnations are beautiful, but their colors are softer, more muted. This new flower is different. Its color is a deep, pure, almost impossibly vibrant crimson. The petals are shaped like a perfect cup or a turban, giving it an exotic, sculptural quality. It stands alone, a splash of alien brilliance in this familiar setting. This is the tulip, and this is our central historical point. The tulip was not native to the Netherlands. It was an immigrant, a foreigner. It arrived in Europe in the mid-16th century, a gift of sorts from the vast and powerful Ottoman Empire. The name tulip itself is believed to derive from the Persian word for turban, band, which it was thought to resemble. For centuries, these flowers had been cultivated and prized in the gardens of Turkey and Persia, a symbol of paradise on earth. The Sultan himself, Suleiman the Magnificent, was a passionate collector. So how did it get here? The story of its journey is a bit like a game of historical telephone, with a few key players. One of the first to bring the bulbs west was a man named Ogir Dibas Bisicu, an ambassador from the Holy Roman Emperor to the court of the Sultan. He saw these incredible flowers in Turkish gardens, was captivated, and sent some bulbs back to Vienna. From Vienna, they spread, slowly at first, as a rare curiosity passed between the botanists and wealthy garden owners of Europe. But its real introduction to the Netherlands, the event that would kickstart the craze, is tied to one man. You see him now, an elderly, bearded scholar, kneeling by the flower bed, examining the new bloom with an intense, academic gaze. This is Carolus Clausius, one of the most renowned botanists of his time. In the 1592, he was invited to become the director of the newly established botanical garden at the University of Leiden, and he brought his personal collection of rare bulbs with him, including these strange and wonderful tulips. Plus, a USS garden at Leiden was not for public display. It was an academic institution, a living library of plants for study. But word of his extraordinary flowers got out. This is a wonderfully specific and slightly comical detail of the story. People were so desperate to get their hands on these new tulips that they repeatedly broke into Klaus, a USS private garden at night, to steal his precious bulbs. He became so frustrated with the constant theft that he almost gave up on cultivating them altogether. But it was too late. The bulbs were out. They began to circulate among a small circle of wealthy Dutch enthusiasts and professional growers. And it quickly became apparent that the tulip was perfectly suited to the Dutch environment. The flat, well-drained, sandy soil of the polder land, reclaimed from the sea, was the ideal medium for growing them. The flowers thrived. Historians still debate the exact moment the tulip transformed from a botanical curiosity into a commercial commodity. Was it Class I USS frustration and the subsequent spread of the stolen bulbs? Or was it an inevitable result of a wealthy, competitive society seeing a beautiful noose at a symbol? It was likely a slow fusion of academic interest, horticultural passion, and the dawning realization among a few clever merchants that there was money to be made here. A lot of money. You look at that single, perfect, crimson tulip, glowing in the soft Dutch light. It is beautiful, certainly, but can a flower really be worth a fortune? To the Dutch of the 17th century, the answer was a resounding yes. They saw in it something more than just a plant. They saw rarity, they saw novelty, they saw exoticist from a distant, romanticized land, and most importantly, in a society obsessed with order and control, they saw a piece of nature that was so perfectly, so impossibly vivid and sculptural, that it almost didn't look real. It looked like a work of art, and in the Dutch Golden Age, art was something they understood very, very well. The quiet, academic garden of careless Klas IS becomes the epicenter of a slowly building tremor. You are still in Leiden, a city renowned not just for its university, but for its prosperous cloth trade and its intellectual vibrancy. It is here, in this specific place and with this specific man, that the story of the tulip takes a crucial turn. Let's spend a moment with Professor Klas IS himself. HES in his late 60s when he arrives in Leiden, a man at the pinnacle of his career. He is not a merchant. He is not a speculator. He is a pure scientist, a man driven by an insatiable curiosity about the natural world. His goal is not to get rich. It is to understand, to classify, and to document. He corresponds with botanists all over Europe, trading not just bulbs, but knowledge. You watch him at work. He is meticulous. He keeps a detailed journal, what he calls his annals, recording the precise date that each of his tulips blooms. He sketches them with scientific accuracy, noting the shape of the petals, the height of the stem, the subtle variations in color. He is creating the first database of tulips in the Netherlands. This work, later published, will become the foundational text for all the growers and collectors who follow. This is the mainstream historical point that tulip craze didn't just spring from a desire for pretty flowers. It had a solid, academic foundation laid by one of Europe's most respected botanists. Klas IS gave the tulip a pedigree, a scientific legitimacy that elevated it above a common garden flower. But Klas IS is a generous scholar, perhaps too generous for his own good. He loves to show off his collection. You see a wealthy merchant, a man used to getting his way, visiting the god. He sees Klas IS's prized tulips and offers to buy some bulbs. Klas IS politely refuses. His bulbs are for study, for exchange with other scholars, not for commercial sale. The merchant, unaccustomed to being told no, is both intrigued and infuriated. This refusal, this air of academic exclusivity, only makes the bulbs more desirable. If they are too precious even for a rich man's money, then they must be very precious indeed. This is what leads to the thefts we mentioned earlier. This is our weirdly specific historical detail for the chapter. The story goes that Klas IS was so dedicated to his research that he would often dissect his rarest bulbs to study their internal structure, destroying a potential fortune in the process. To the commercially minus-minded Dutch, this was an act of mere minus insanity. They couldn't stand to see such valuable objects being wasted on science. So, they took matters into their own hands. Under the cover of darkness, these early tulip fanatics would sneak into the university garden with trowels and lanterns, digging up the professor's most cherished specimens. It's a wonderful, almost comical image, the country's future national flower beginning its life as contraband, smuggled out of an old professor's garden in the dead of night. This is where a subtle historical debate emerges. How much responsibility does Klas IS bear for the mania that followed? One school of thought sees him as an innocent victor, a pure academic whose passion was hijacked by greedy speculators. He created the interest, but he never intended for it to become a financial frenzy. Another perspective, however, argues that Klas IS, perhaps unintentionally, created the perfect conditions for the bubble by treating the bulbs as rare treasures, by refusing to sell them, and by focusing only on the most elite and wealthy collectors. He established the tulip's reputation as an object of extreme exclusivity. He built the velvet trout. The speculators just figured out how to sell tickets to get behind it. He wasn't a participant in the mania, but he was its unwitting architect. You stand in that garden at Leiden, a place of quiet scholarship and leafy tranquility, but you can feel the tension building. The world outside the garden walls is beginning to take notice. The stolen bulbs are being passed from hand to hand, replanted in the private gardens of wealthy merchants in Amsterdam and Haarlem. They are being propagated, their offspring bulbs carefully nurtured. The tulip is escaping the laboratory. It's moving from the world of science to the world of commerce. Professor Klaus Ayos, in his quest to understand and catalogue this beautiful new flower, has accidentally unleashed a powerful force. He has introduced an object of intense, focused desire into a society awash with cash and competitive energy. He just wanted to study a flower. He has no idea that he has just lit the fuse on a financial and cultural explosion. The academic tranquility of Leiden's botanical garden gives way to the bustling, competitive world of a wealthy merchant's private estate in Amsterdam. The air here smells not of damp earth, but of money. The house is grand, filled with expensive furniture, Chinese porcelain, and, most importantly, paintings. The walls are covered with art, a testament to the owner's wealth and sophisticated taste. You follow the merchant out of his house and into his garden. This is his pride and joy, a place where he truly competes with his peers. And here, you see the tulip in its new role. It is no longer a scientific specimen. It is a jewel, a living treasure displayed with the same pride as a diamond or a ruby. You see a flower bed that is utterly different from the public parks you might be used to. The tulips are not planted in large, colorful masses. Instead, each individual flower is given its own space, planted in a neat row with a respectful distance between it and its neighbor. Each bloom is presented like a sculpture in a gallery. The merchant walks you down the row, pointing out each one by name. This is a viceroy. This is a general of generals. This one, he says with a particular gleam in his eye, is his Emperor Augustus, the rarest and most coveted of them all. This is the central historical point in these early days. The tulip was a luxury good, a status symbol on par with fine art. Its appeal was rooted in its sheer, shocking visual power. To a 17th-century European eye, accustomed to the more delicate palette of native flowers, the tulip was a revelation. Its colors were pure, saturated, and impossibly bold. The reds were true, blood minus red. The yellows were brilliant, unadulterated lemon minus yellow. The whites were as pure as snow. This intensity of color was something new, something modern. The Dutch, who were masters of pigments in their painting, recognized and appreciated this quality in a flower. Owning a tulip with a particularly pure and strong color was like owning a masterpiece by a great painter. And this is where we get to the core of the obsession. The most valuable tulips were not the single minus-colored ones. As beautiful as they were, the real prizes, the ones that drove men to madness, were the broken tulips. These were tulips that had two or more colors on their petals, arranged in intricate, feathered, or striped patterns. They were called bizarre as yellow or cream backgrounds with red or purple stripes, luminous white or lilac backgrounds with purple or pink flames, and rose as white backgrounds with shades of red and pink. Each broken tulip was unique. The pattern of flames and feathers on its petals was a 1 minus of minus a minus a minus kind work of art, created by nature. This uniqueness was key to their value. You couldn't just grow another one exactly like it. This made them the ultimate collector's item. Here's our weird and wonderful scientific detail. No one at the time knew what caused this beautiful breaking of the colors. They had all sorts of theories. Some thought it was due to the soil conditions. Others believed you could induce it by mixing different colored powders into the soil or by storing the bulbs next to each other. They were all wrong. It wasn't until the 1922, almost 300 years later, that scientists discovered the truth. The beautiful patterns were the result of a virus, specifically the tulip-breaking virus, which was spread by aphids. The sickness of the plant was the very thing that made it beautiful and valuable. The most prized flowers in the Netherlands were, in fact, disease. This leads to a fascinating historical debate. Was the tulip craze an aesthetic phenomenon or a financial one? Did people desire these flowers because they were genuinely captivated by their beauty? Or was it purely about the investment and the potential for profit? The aesthetic argument points to the deep appreciation for art and nature in Dutch culture. These people were connoisseurs. They were captivated by the rarity and the unique, unpredictable beauty of the broken tulips. The money was a secondary consequence of this shared passion. The financial argument says that the beauty was just a pretext. The tulip bulb became a convenient, tangible object onto which a whole society could project its speculative fantasies. It could have been anything: a rare seashell, a type of spice. The flower itself was irrelevant. It was the market that mattered. As you stand in that merchant's garden, it seems clear that, in these early stages, the two are inextricably linked. The merchant genuinely loves his flowers. He speaks of them with the passion of a true collector, but he is also keenly aware of their monetary value. He knows that the Semper Augustus blooming in his garden is worth more than the carriage and horses he used to arrive here. The line between passion and investment, between beauty and asa, is beginning to blur, and it is in that blurry, intoxicating space that the mania will truly take hold. The obsession with owning these living jewels begins to ripple out from the gardens of the super-rich. It's no longer just about having a beautiful flower to look at. It's about possessing the potential for that beauty. The focus shifts from the ephemeral bloom to the humble, lumpy, and surprisingly durable object that produces it, the bulb. You are now in the drawing room of another wealthy merchant in Harlem, a city that is becoming a major center of the tulip trade. The merchant isn't showing off his garden. He is showing off his collection of bulbs. He leads you to a large, beautifully crafted wooden cabinet. He unlocks it with a small key and swings open the doors. Inside, on shelves lined with velvet, sit not flowers, but dozens of tulip bulbs, each one resting in its own little compartment with a handwritten label identifying its variety. This is a true blooming cabinet, a joy flower cabinet. It is the 17th-century equivalent of a Swiss bank vault for flowers. The merchant picks one up. It looks like a slightly oversized onion, brown and flaky. To you, it's just a lump of organic matter. To him, it is a concentration of immense value and future possibility. This is the central, mainstream point of this phase of the craze. The tulip market wasn't really about flowers. It was about bulbs. The flower itself was a fleeting thing, blooming for only a week or to a year. But the bulb was an asset. It was a durable good that could be stored, transported, and, most importantly, traded. This shift from flower to bulb was what allowed a horticultural hobby to transform into a financial market. You can't trade a flower that's going to wilt in a few days, but you can trade a bulb that holds its value for months. And the bulb had another magical property: it multiplied. A healthy tulip bulb, after flowering, would often produce one or two smaller offset bulbs, or clones. This meant that owning a rare bulb was like owning a tiny, minus printing machine. The next year, you wouldn't just have your original flower. You would have 2 or 3 more bulbs to sell or trade. This potential for propagation was a huge driver of the speculative fever. You weren't just buying an object. You were buying an investment that could grow. Here's a wonderfully weird detail about this obsession. Because the bulbs were so valuable, and because they only bloomed for a short period in the spring, growers and collectors needed a way to advertise their wares during the rest of the year. This led to the creation of tulip books. These were beautifully illustrated catalogs, with watercolor paintings of each variety of tulip the seller owned. A potential buyer could browse the book, choose the flower they desire, and then place an order for the bulb, which would be delivered months later after it had been lifted from the ground. These tulip books are now incredibly rare and valuable works of art in their own right, a gorgeous paper trail of the floral frenzy. This leads to a subtle but important historical debate: how much of this was a rich man's game versus a true, society-wide phenomenon. The traditional story of Tulip Mania often portrays a whole country, from aristocrats to chimney sweeps, being caught up in the madness. But some modern economic historians have pushed back on this idea. They argue that in these early stages, it was an exclusive hobby for the very wealthy. They point to the fact that a single bulb of a desirable variety could cost several thousand guilders. For context, a skilled craftsman at the time might earn about 300 guilders a year. The annual income of a prosperous merchant might be 3,000 guilders. so a single bulb could literally cost more than a year's income for even a very well minus off individual. This was something a baker or a weaver could afford to dabble in. This revisionist view argues that the story of the common man being ruined by tulips has been exaggerated. The real high-minus stakes trading, they claim, was confined to a small, elite circle of wealthy merchants, unprofessional growers who knew what they were doing. It was a high-minus risk, high-minus reward game for people who could afford to lose. But other historians stick to the traditional narrative, arguing that, while the most expensive bulbs were out of reach for most, a lively market for cheaper, more common varieties did develop, drawing in people from the middle and even working classes. The dream of getting rich quick, they argue, is a powerful and universal temptation. You look at the merchant, lovingly cradling his ugly brown bulb. He sees its future. He sees the crimson and white minus feathered masterpiece it will produce. He sees the offspring it will create, and he sees the ever minus increasing price his friends and rivals are willing to pay for it. He is a man in the grip of a powerful and very specific kind of desire. The tulip is no longer just a flower. It is a promise, a dream, an asset, and the stage is now set for that dream to be turned into a full minus blow, unregulated, and dangerously unstable market. Let's stay in this world of collectors and their prized bulbs for a moment longer and delve deeper into the mystery that sat at the very heart of the craze, the breaking of the tulips. You are in the garden of an experienced grower, a man known throughout the Netherlands for his skill. He has beds filled with solid minus-colored tulip straw, healthy and reliable. These are the workhorses of the tulip world. They are beautiful and they have value, but they are predictable. They are not the source of the real excitement. The grower leads you to a separate, almost sacred, part of his garden. You under careful watch, are his broken tulips. You see a flower that was once a solid deep purple, now magnificently flamed with streaks of pure white. You see another that was a simple yellow, now feathered with intricate lines of brilliant red. These are his masterpieces. They are also his biggest headache. This is the central, mainstream point we need to understand. The breaking of tulips was completely unpredictable. A grower could plant a bed of 1,000 solid red tulips, and the next spring, one single flower might, by some seeming miracle, emerge with broken colors. Or, though none of them might, there was no way to force it, and no way to guarantee it. This randomness, this scarcity, was the engine of their immense value. A masterpiece could not be commissioned. It could only be hoped for. And once a tulip broke, a new set of problems emerged. This is all weirdly fascinating scientific detail, though they didn't know it at the time. The virus that caused the beautiful patterns also weakened the plant. A broken tulip produced fewer and weaker offset bulbs than its healthy, solid minus-colored parent, and its offspring were also unpredictable. A bulb from a broken tulip might produce a broken flower the next year, or it might revert to its original solid color, or, most frustratingly of all, it might produce a flower with a completely different, inferior broken pattern. This made cultivating rare broken tulips an exercise in high minus stakes horticulture. It could take 7 years or more for a tulip to grow from a seed to a flowering bulb. That seed might produce a beautiful, strong, solid minus-colored flower. You would then have to wait 4 years, hoping that one of its offspring bulbs would one day decide to break and produce a masterpiece. The entire process was a long, slow, and uncertain gamble. This is why the most famous tulips, like the legendary Semper Augustus, were so astronomically expensive. There were maybe only a dozen or so bulbs of that specific, stable variety in existence. Their owners were not just selling a flower. They were selling decades of careful cultivation and incredible luck. This inherent unpredictability leads to a heated debate among historians and economists. Was Tulip Mania a classic example of a speculative bubble, driven by irrational human psychology? Or was there a rational basis for the high prices? The irrational bubble theory is a traditional story. It argues that the prices became completely detached from any real minus world value. People were buying bulbs, not because they wanted the flower, but because they believed they could sell the bulb to someone else, a greater fool, for a higher price. The market was based on pure belief, and when that belief evaporated, the whole thing crashed. But a more recent, revisionist school of thought argues that the market was, in its own way, rational. They point out that these rare broken tulips were genuinely scarce. You couldn't just produce more of them on demand. The prices were high because the supply was incredibly, frustratingly, limited. They argue that the contracts being traded were for a unique luxury good with a highly restricted supply, and therefore the high prices made a certain kind of economic sense. It wasn't a market for flowers. It was a market for masterpieces. The crash, they argue, wasn't caused by a loss of faith in the tulip's beauty, but by external factors, like changes in contract law or even an outbreak of the bubonic plague which disrupted the market. You watch the grower as he tenderly examines a leaf on one of his broken flowers, looking for any sign of weakness. He is a scientist, an artist, and a gambler all rolled into one. His relationship with these flowers is complex. He is captivated by their beauty, but he is also trapped by their fragility and their infuriating unpredictability. He knows that the very sickness that creates their beauty is also a threat to their existence. He is a guardian of a beautiful, fragile, and incredibly valuable secret. But that secret is about to get out, and the world of quiet, patient growers is about to be invaded by a new kind of enthusiast painter. The real -life garden, with its scent of damp earth and living flowers, begins to fade. It's replaced by the smell of linseed oil, turpentine, and drying pigments. You're now inside the studio of a Dutch Golden Age painter. The room is filled with a northern light so clear and so perfect, it feels like a physical substance. The artist, a man in a paint-spattered smock, is standing before an easel, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. On a small table next to him is the subject of his work. It's a vase, but not a simple one. It's an ornate piece of Chinese porcelain, itself a luxury import, and arranged in the vase is a bouquet of flowers. But this is no ordinary bouquet. It is a gathering of superstars. There are roses, irises, and carnations, but taking center stage, positioned with the utmost care, are three magnificent, broken tulips. One is a deep purple streaked with lilac, a biblomen. Another is a brilliant yellow feathered with red, the bizarre. The third is a perfect, white speckled rose with delicate pink flames licking up its sides. This is a bouquet that, in real life, would be worth a fortune. The artist is not just painting flowers. He is painting money. He is painting status. He is painting a dream. This is the central, mainstream point of this chapter, the explosion of tulip still -life. Painting was directly intertwined with the flowers' immense value and cultural significance. These paintings were not just pretty decorations. They were complex documents of wealth, taste, and the fleeting nature of beauty. For a wealthy merchant who owned these priceless bulbs, commissioning a painting of them was a brilliant move. The flower itself would bloom and die in a week, but the painting was forever. It was a way to immortalize his prized possessions, to show them off to guests all year round. The painting became a permanent record of his success, a certificate of his membership in the exclusive club of tulip connoisseurs. And for those who couldn't afford the real bulbs, buying a tulip painting was the next best thing. It was a way to participate in the craze, to bring a symbol of this modern, luxurious world into their own homes. The paintings themselves became a desirable commodity, a secondary market driven by the primary market for the bulbs. Here's a wonderfully weird and specific detail you'll notice if you look closely at these paintings. The artists often took liberties. They would paint fantasy bouquets, collections of flowers that could never have existed in real life. Why? Because different flowers bloomed at different times of the year. A rose from June and a tulip from April would never be in the same vase. The artist wasn't painting from a real bouquet. He was working from individual sketches he had made earlier, or even from illustrations in the tulip box. He was constructing a perfect, idealized version of nature, an impossible gathering of floral celebrities. This is where art historians have a fascinating debate. What was the deeper meaning of these paintings? Were they simply a celebration of wealth and beauty? A form of floral portraiture for rich patrons? That's one interpretation. The paintings are saying, look at the incredible, beautiful, and expensive things my owner can afford. But another, more complex interpretation sees these paintings as Vanita's still minus lives, a very popular genre in the 17th-century Netherlands. Vanita's paintings were moral allegories, reminders of the fleeting nature of life, the vanity of worldly possessions, and the certainty of death. In this reading, the beautiful, perfect tulip is a symbol of earthly beauty that will inevitably fade and die. You often see a wilting petal, a buzzing fly, or a skull placed subtly in the composition to drive the message home. The painting is a warning: do not put your faith in these worldly treasures, for they are temporary. True value lies in the hereafter. So which is it? Is the painting a boast or a sermon? A celebration of wealth or a critique of it? The genius of these Dutch artists is that the paintings are almost always both at the same time. They allow the wealthy merchant to have it both ways. He gets to show off his incredible wealth and taste, while also demonstrating his pious understanding that it's all just temporary. It's a masterful piece of cultural and religious negotiation. You watch the artist add a tiny, perfect dead drop to one of the tulip petals. He is capturing a moment of impossible perfection. He is freezing time, in a world where the real flower is a fragile, temporary, and ridiculously expensive commodity. His painting offers a different kind of value permanence. The canvas becomes a safer, more stable home for the tulip than any garden could ever be. The quiet, contemplative world of the artist's studio dissolves, and you find yourself propelled into the noisy, charged atmosphere of pure commerce. The year is now 1634. The appreciation for tulips has tipped over from a passionate hobby into a full-blown, raging fever. The price of a single bulb is no longer just high. It has become detached from any recognizable reality. You are in the grand office of a wealthy Amsterdam merchant. He is not looking at paintings or flowers. He is looking at a ledger. On the page are columns of figures that make you dizzy. He is tracking the value of his investments, and his most profitable asset is not his fleet of ships or his warehouses full of spices. It is his collection of tulip bulbs. This is the central, mainstream point of this phase of the story. This is where Tulip Mania truly becomes mania. The prices enter a period of exponential, vertiginous growth. A bulb that was worth 100 guilders a year ago is now worth 1. Zeroth, a bulb that was worth 1,000 euro is now being quoted at 5. Zeroth, for context, a grand townhouse on a desirable Amsterdam canal might cost you 10,000 guilders. A single, ugly, brown flower bulb could now be worth half as much as a house. Let's look at some documented examples, because they are genuinely mind-boggling. A single bulb of the Viceroy variety was famously traded for a basket of goods worth around 500 guilders. The basket included tons of wheaten dry, for fat oxen, 8 pigs, a dozen sheep, 2 large casks of wine, 4 barrels of beer, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a bed with all its furnishings, and a silver drinking cup. All of that for 1 bulb. And the Viceroy wasn't even one of the most elite varieties. A single bulb of the legendary Semper Augustus could fetch 500 guilders, or more the price of a country estate. Why was this happening? The fundamental drivers were still there: the rarity of the broken bolts, the desire for status, the backdrop of a wealthy society. But a new and powerful psychological accelerant was added to the fire: the fear of missing out. People saw their neighbors getting rich, seemingly overnight, by trading in these strange floral commodities. They heard stories of a man who bought a bulb for 50 guilders and sold it a month later for 500. The temptation became irresistible. It seemed like a foolproof way to make money. The price only ever went up. This is where the market starts to broaden. It's no longer just the superminers rich and the professional growers. The middle classes, shopkeepers, skilled artisans, clerks start to enter the fray. They might not be able to afford a Semper Augustus, but they can pool their savings to buy a share in a more modest bulb, or they can buy a cheaper variety, hoping its value will be pulled up by the rising tide. Here's a weirdly specific and tragic anecdote that illustrates the madness. It's a famous story, though its historical accuracy is debated. A sailor, just returned from a long voyage, was given what he thought was an onion as a snack. He sat down undated with his herring for lunch. It turned out to be a priceless Viceroy tulip bulb, belonging to the merchant whose ship he was on. The sailor was allegedly thrown in prison for a crime that was valued as highly as grand larceny. Whether it's true or not, the story perfectly captures the absurdity of the moment. A world where an object that looks like an onion can be more valuable than gold. This leads us to the great debate among economic historians. What kind of bubble was this? Was it a rational bubble or an irrational one? The rational argument, which we touched on before, suggests there were logical reasons for the high prices, primarily the extreme scarcity of the product. Proponents of this view say that it's unfair to judge the prices by our modern standards. For a 17th-century Dutchman, this was the ultimate luxury good, like a unique work of art by Leonardo da Vinci. What is the correct price for the Mona Lisa? It's whatever someone is willing to pay. The irrational argument, which is the more traditional view, claims that the market was driven by pure speculative frenzy, a classic case of what they call greater fool theory. The person buying a bulb for $5 guilders wasn't doing it because they believed the bulb was intrinsically worth that much. They were doing it because they believed they could find an even greater fool to buy it from them for $6 guilders next week. The price was based on nothing but collective belief and momentum. Once new fools stopped showing up, the entire pyramid would collapse. You look at the merchant's ledger. The numbers are climbing, day by day. He is making a fortune on paper, but his wealth is tied up in a collection of dormant, perishable organic matter buried in the ground. Is he a savvy investor in a booming market for a new luxury good? Or is he a fool, caught in a collective delusion, dancing on the edge of a financial cliff? In 1634, the answer isn't clear, but the party's about to get a whole lot wilder. The grand, wood-miner-spaneled offices of the Amsterdam merchants begin to feel too formal, too slow for the pace of the booming Tulip market. The action is moving to a new, more democratic, and far more chaotic venue. You find yourself pushing through a thick cloud of pipe smoke into the back room of a tavern in Harlem. The air is thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and money. This is a colleague i.e., or connage, where the tulip traders now meet to do their business. The room is packed. It's a motley collection of men, a cross-minus section of Dutch society. You see wealthy merchants in their fine black coats, but they are rubbing shoulders with weavers, bakers, brewers, and cobblers. The social hierarchy of the outside world seems to have been temporarily suspended. Here, in the smoky confines of the tavern, a man is judged not by his birth or his profession, but by the quality of the bulbs he has to sell and the weight of the coin in his purse. This is the central point. The tulip market has now escaped the confines of the elite and has become a popular obsession, drawing in speculators from all walks of life. You watch the trading. It's loud, fast, and fueled by copious amounts of beer and Dutch gin. A man stands on a chair, holding up a single, lumpy bulb. A gouda, he shouts. A fine specimen. Who will start the bidding at 300 guilders and shoot up? The price climbs rapidly. The atmosphere is electric, a combination of a high-minus stakes auction and a drunken party. Fortunes are being made and lost in the time it takes to drink a glass of ale. These tavern-minus-based trading sessions were a crucial development. They made the market accessible. You didn't need a formal introduction to a wealthy merchant to participate. You just needed to show up at the pub. They also made the market more liquid and more volatile. Trades were happening constantly, and prices could fluctuate wildly based on the mood of the room, a piece of news, or simply how much everyone had had to drink. Here's a wonderfully specific detail about how these tavern trades were to make the deals binding. The Dutch used a system called wijn koop, or wine buy. When a price was agreed upon, the buyer and seller would seal the deal with a shared drink. The buyer would often pay a small, no-refundable deposit, perhaps to 0.5% of the total price, called wine money. This was used to buy a round of drinks for the house, celebrating the transaction. The rest of the money was due when the bulb was physically delivered, often months later. This system, based on alcohol and social pressure, was surprisingly effective, at least while everyone believed the prices would keep going up. This leads to a historical debate about the nature of these new traders, the common folk who flocked to the taverns, the traditional narrative, popularized by the 19th-century Scottish journalist Charles Mackay in his famous book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, paints a picture of a nation of greedy, ignorant gamblers. Mackay describes weavers abandoning their looms and farmers selling their land, all to speculate on tulips. His account portrays the mania as a moral failing, a cautionary tale about the dangers of mob psychology and irrational greed. However, more recent historians, like in Goldgar, have presented a more nuanced view. After painstakingly researching the actual archives, Goldgar argues that the number of people involved, especially from the lower classes, was much smaller than Mackay claimed. She suggests that the market was still dominated by a relatively small network of wealthy merchants and growers. Even in the taverns, the stories of chimney sweeps and maids getting rich were likely exaggerated anecdotes, the 17th-century equivalent of urban legends, used by later writers to make the story more dramatic. So, who is right? Was it a society-wide madness, as Mackay vividly described, or a more limited, yet still frantic, market primarily run by a network of connected insiders? As Goldgar's research suggests, the truth is probably somewhere in between. It's unlikely that every single person in the Netherlands was trading tulips, but it's clear that the craze had captured the popular imagination and had drawn in a significant number of new, less experienced, and more vulnerable speculators. You look at the face of a weaver who has just successfully bid on a bulb, his eyes shining with a mixture of excitement and terror. He has just bet his family's savings on the future value of a single flower. In this smoky, boisterous room, surrounded by the infectious optimism of the crowd, it feels like a brilliant move. The dream of life minus changing wealth feels intoxicating like loss. But the tavern is a place of illusion, and the dream is built on a foundation of smoke, beer, and a collective agreement to ignore reality for just a little while longer. Let's leave the smoky chaos of the tavern and focus on the object at the heart of all this frantic trading, the bulb itself. You are now standing in the muddy, windswept field of a professional grower in the countryside outside Haarlem. It is late summer, the lifting season. The flowers have long since died back, and now is the time to carefully dig up the precious bulbs for storage and, more importantly, for delivery to the buyers who purchased them months ago. A worker kneels on the ground, gently loosening the soil with a trowel. He reaches in and pulls out a lumpy, dirt-skate clump. He brushes it off carefully. This is the prize. It's not a single bulb, but a small family. There's the large mother bulb, and attached to its base are 2 or 3 smaller offset bulbs, the caelisters. He separates them with the skill of a surgeon. The mother bulb will be sold to fulfill a contract. The smaller offsets are the grower's profit, the foundation of next year's crop. You pick one of the mother bulbs and hold it in your hand. It's dense and heavy for its size. You are holding a potential masterpiece, but how can you tell? How did these 17th-century traders judge the quality of something so plain and unappealing? This is the central point. A whole new field of expertise emerged, a kind of bulb connoisseurship that was essential for anyone participating in the market. An experienced grower could tell a lot just by looking and feel. They would judge a bulb by its weight, its shape, and the condition of its outer skin, or tunic. A heavy, firm bulb was a healthy bulb. A bulb with a clean, unbroken tunic, free from any signs of rot or mildew, was a good sign. The most desirable bulbs had a specific, tear-like shape. An oddly shaped or elongated bulb was considered inferior. But the most important factor was something you couldn't see: its pedigree. The reputation of the grower was paramount. A bulb from a famous, reputable grower was worth far more than an identical bulb from an unknown source. The growers guarded their reputations fiercely. They knew that their name was their brand, a guarantee of quality and authenticity in a market filled with uncertainty. This is how weirdly specific detail the names of the tulips themselves. The Dutch gave their prized varieties incredibly grand, evocative, and often militaristic names. You had the Admiral van der Rijck, the General Beau, and the Viceroy. The most sought after tulips were part of a group known as the Incomparables. Naming a new variety was a crucial part of marketing it. A good name could add significantly to a bulb's value. It gave the ugly brown lump a story, a personality, a sense of grandeur. This brings us to a historical debate about knowledge and information in the tulip market. How much did the average speculator, the weaver or the baker in the tavern, really know about what they were buying? One perspective is that they were acting in near minus total ignorance. They were lambs to the slaughter, buying bulbs based on nothing more than a fancy name and the hype of the crowd. They didn't know how to judge a bulb's quality. They didn't understand the risks of disease. They were gambling on an asset they fundamentally did not understand, making them incredibly vulnerable to scams and bad information. The other perspective argues that we shouldn't underestimate them. In a society so obsessed with tulips, a surprising amount of specialized knowledge would have trickled down. These were not stupid people. A weaver was an expert in textiles, a baker in grains. They would have applied their craftsmanship, offered detail and quality to the new commodity. They would have listened, learned, and quickly become savvy. If amateur judges of a bulb's potential, they knew they were taking a risk. But it was a more calculated risk than the traditional story often allows. You look at the bulb in your hand. It is an object of profound faith. You have to believe that this inert, ugly thing will, in 6 months' time, produce a flower of breathtaking beauty. You have to believe that the grower is honest and that the bulb is healthy and is the variety he claims it is. You have to believe that the small offsets it produces will themselves grow into valuable assets. And most of all, you have to believe that, when the time comes to sell, someone else will share that faith and be willing to pay you even more for it. The entire tulip economy is built on this chain of belief. It is a system that works perfectly, as long as nobody, at any point in the chain, stops believing. The muddy field, with its promise of future fortune, proceeds, and you are ushered into a world where the dream of the tulip has found its purest, most potent form. You are standing in a hushed, velvet lined display case, not in a garden, but in the most exclusive art dealer's gallery in Amsterdam. The light here is soft, direct, and in the center of the display, bathed in a reverent glow, sits not a robo, but a meticulously rendered painting. It's a still minus life, but one focused almost entirely on a single, transcendent blue. This is the Emperor Augustus, and as you gaze upon its painted perfection, you understand instantly why it was the king of tulips, the ultimate prize, the obsession that drove men to extremes. Its petals are pure, dazzling white, so white they seem to emit their own light. Against this pristine background, dramatic, fiery streaks of crimson erupt upwards from the base of each petal, creating an asymmetrical, unpredictable, and breathtaking pattern. It looks like a feather, or a flame, or a bolt of lightning, captured in floral form. It is impossibly beautiful, a work of natural art so exquisite it feels almost supernatural. This is the central, mainstream historical fact. The Emperor Augustus was the most famous and desired tulip during the height of Tulip Mania. Its name, Latin for always majestic or always august, perfectly reflects its status. There were likely never more than a few dozen Emperor Augustus bulbs in existence at any one time, making it incredibly rare. Its broken pattern, caused by the virus, was considered particularly stable and beautiful, making its appearance consistent and thus highly sought after. And its value was simply astronomical. At the peak of the mania, a single Emperor Augustus bulb was famously traded for 12 acres of land, or a grand house on an Amsterdam canal, or a fortune in gold and silver. It was worth more than the average Dutchman could earn in a lifetime. To own a Emperor Augustus was not just a sign of wealth. It was a declaration of supreme status, a public boast that you had conquered both nature and the financial markets. Here's a weirdly specific detail about its mystique. The Emperor Augustus was so valuable that it was almost never actually planted in the ground by its owners. To plant it was to risk it. It might rot, it might get stolen, or it might revert to a solid color. Instead, owners would often keep the bulbs indoors, sometimes even displayed in special cabinets, like the dry flower cabinets we mentioned. When they needed to show off its bloom, they would sometimes rent a single flower from a reputable grower, have it delivered, display it for a day or two, and then return it. They were renting the fleeting experience of beauty, not risking their ultimate asset. This leads to a fascinating historical debate. Was the Emperor Augustus genuinely more beautiful than other broken tulips? Or was its value primarily driven by its extreme rarity and the narrative woven around it? Some historians argue that its beauty was indeed unparalleled, a subjective but widely agreed minus upon aesthetic judgment that justified its premium. Its unique, fiery pattern truly stood out in an already stunning group of flowers. However, other scholars suggest that its extraordinary price was largely a product of hype and the Veblen effect, the idea that an item's value increases, not because of its intrinsic utility or beauty, but simply because it is expensive and thus a symbol of status. The Emperor Augustus became the ultimate trophy asset, its value inflated by its unreachability for most. It was the Mona Lisa of the tulip world, a masterpiece whose fame was self-reinforcing. It was beautiful, certainly, but perhaps not that much more beautiful than a dozen other rare varieties. Its true genius was its rarity, and its marketing. You stand before the painted image, mesmerized. The artist has captured not just the flower, but the dream. The Emperor Augustus is the embodiment of the mania, the pinnacle of the obsession. It is the purest expression of how a simple, fragile piece of nature could be transformed, through the alchemy of human desire and speculation, into an object of unimaginable wealth. But behind its painted perfection, the real world bulb still sat, a silent, dormant lamp, oblivious to the fortunes being built and destroyed on its behalf. The pristine gallery fades, replaced by the bustling, noisy interior of a weaver's cottage. The air is dull, heavy with the smell of woolen, the rhythmic clatter of a hand loom. The man, his hands calloused from years of working the threads, sits hunched over his loom. But he isn't just focused on his weaving. Every few minutes, he glances nervously at a small, crudely drawn chart tacked to the wall. It's a record of tulip prices, scribbled in hurried, almost illegible handwriting. This is the humble, everyday front line of Tulip Mania. This is the central, mainstream point. The mania was not confined to the wealthy. It eventually permeated deeper into Dutch society, drawing in ordinary craftsmen, shopkeepers, and even servants. The dream of getting rich quick became a seductive siren call that reached far beyond the gilded salons and into the working class homes of the Dutch Republic. These were not people with vast fortunes to risk. They were people with meager savings, a small inheritance, or even just the promise of future earnings. You see a small, rough wooden box tucked under his bed. Inside, nestled in sawdust, are 3 tulip bulbs, not a Emperor Augustus, certainly, but perhaps a General Bull or Viceroy varieties that were still incredibly expensive, but not entirely out of reach if one pooled resources or leveraged their credit. This man, the weaver, has sunk a significant portion of his life's savings into these 3 lumps of organic matter. Why did they do it? The primary motivator was simple: the seemingly effortless possibility of astronomical wealth. Stories circulated like wildfire about humble individuals who had become rich overnight. A maid who bought a small bulb and sold it for enough to buy a house. A baker who traded a batch of bread for a bulb and flipped it for a fortune. These stories, whether entirely true or exaggerated, were the fuel of the craze. They tapped into a universal human desire for upward mobility, for escaping the grinding reality of daily labor. This is our weirdly specific detail, the mechanics of how these ordinary people participated. They often didn't buy whole bulbs outright. Instead, they bought shares or fractions of bulbs, Imagine buying a slice of a pizza rather than the whole pie. A very expensive bulb could be divided into pellets a measure of weight, and people could buy small quantities of these pellets. This fractional ownership made even the rarest bulbs seem accessible, allowing people with limited capital to participate in the high minor stakes game. They were playing with paper, promises, and a deep, infectious optimism. This brings us to a crucial historical debate: how widespread was the participation of the common man, and how devastating was the financial impact on them when the bubble burst? The traditional narrative, most famously propagated by Charles Mackay, paints a picture of widespread ruin, of thousands of ordinary people driven to poverty and despair. He describes a moral breakdown, with people abandoning their trades to chase speculative fantasies. However, more recent historians, like Goldgar, have presented a more nuanced view. After painstakingly researching the actual archives, Goldgar argues that the number of people involved, especially from the lower classes, was much smaller than Mackay claimed. Our research suggests that while some ordinary people did participate, the really large, speculative transactions were still concentrated among a relatively small group of wealthy, experienced traders. She found little evidence of widespread, systemic financial ruin among the artisan class. The number of people who lost everything was likely far smaller than traditionally claimed. The popular image of the ruined baker might be more literary than historical. You watch the weaver, his eyes darting between his loom and his tulip jar. He is tired, but his gaze holds a flicker of hope, a desperate longing for a better life. He is not just weaving cloth, he is weaving dreams, and his dreams, and the dreams of thousands like him, are tied to the fate of a few brown, lumpy boats, buried somewhere in the cold Dutch earth, waiting for spring. The market is still climbing, and for now, his gamble feels like a stroke of genius. But the higher it climbs, the further it has to fall. The weaver's cottage fades, and you're back in the smoky tavern. But the energy in the room has changed. It's no longer just about buying and selling physical bulbs. The fever has intensified, and the market has detached itself almost entirely from the reality of lumpy, brown objects buried in the ground. You are now witnessing the infamous wind trade. You see a merchant, not holding a bulb or even a tulip, but a small, folded piece of paper. HES, shouting, gesticulating wildly. Who will buy my share in the Admiral and Uri IJCT? Delivery in May. Another man, without seeing the paper, shouts back a higher price. No money changes hands immediately. No bulbs are inspected. It's all about the promise, the future, the sheer momentum of the market. This is the central, mainstream point at the height of Tulip Mania. The vast majority of transactions were not for physical tulip bulbs. They were for futures contracts. People were buying and selling pieces of paper that promised the delivery of a specific bulb at a future date, usually in May or June, after the growing season. This practice, known as the wind trade wind handle in Dutch, meant you were literally buying and selling wind, the promise of something that didn't yet exist, or at least wasn't yet deliverable. Imagine buying a house today based only on a drawing, without ever seeing the house itself, and then selling the right to that drawing to someone else before the house is even built, and then that person sells the right to someone else. That's the wind trade. This system allowed for incredible leverage. You didn't need to have the full price of a bulb to buy a contract for it. You just needed a small down payment, and the promise to pay the rest later. This meant that even someone with limited capital could control a large number of valuable bulbs on paper, amplifying both their potential gains and their potential losses. The market functioned on a system of trust and a shared, powerful belief that prices would continue to rise. Everyone assumed they could sell their contract for a higher price before delivery date, never having to take possession of the expensive bulb themselves. The game wasn't about growing or owning flowers. It was about flipping contracts. This is our wonderfully weird detail: the legal ambiguity of these contracts. The Dutch government and legal system had no real framework for dealing with futures contracts for perishable goods like tulip bulbs. Many of these contracts were not legally binding in the way a modern stock certificate would be. They were often based on informal agreements, gentlemen's promises, and wine money deposit. This meant that if a price suddenly dropped, a buyer could simply walk away from a contract, arguing it was an unenforceable gambling debt. This inherent instability, built into the very fabric of the market, would become a critical weakness when confidence began to erode. This leads to a fierce historical debate about the legality and morality of the wine trade. Some historians argue that it was essentially sophisticated gambling, a form of financial innovation that simply lacked the regulatory oversight of a modern market. They point out that futures trading, in a more regulated form, is a legitimate and often essential part of modern commodity markets. The Dutch were just ahead of their time, developing complex financial instruments without the accompanying legal safeguards. Other historians, however, condemn the wine trade as pure, unadulterated speculation, a morally bankrupt system designed to separate fools from their money. They emphasize the element of fraud and delusion, arguing that the contracts were merely a thinly veiled pretext for a pyramid scheme. They point to the fact that the underlying asset, the tulip bulb, was often unseen and undelivered, making the entire market purely psychological. The real value is not in the bulb, but in the air of inflated expectations. You watch the men in the tavern, their faces flushed with excitement and gin. They are not talking about the beauty of a Semper Augustus or the potential for its propagation. They are talking about numbers. They are talking about profits. They are talking about how much higher the price will go tomorrow. The tulip has become an abstract symbol, a token in a giant, unregulated game of musical chairs. The sound of shouts and laughter fills the air. It's intoxicating. It feels like everyone is winning. Everyone is getting richer. The possibility of failure seems utterly remote, a distant whisper in the face of such overwhelming, collective optimism. The market has taken on a life of its own, driven by pure momentum. It is a giant, collective act of make-believe, and everyone is invested in keeping the illusion alive. But illusions, no matter how grand, always have a moment of truth, and for the tulip, that moment is fast approaching. The intoxicating roar of the wine trade in the taverns has reached a fever pitch. The prices for tulip bulbs, or rather, the paper contracts representing them, are no longer just rising. They are defying gravity, accelerating upwards at a speed that makes even the most seasoned merchants gasp. The year is now 1637. The winter months, typically a slower period for bulb trading as the bulbs are dormant, have become the most frantic. Everyone is convinced that this is the moment to get in, to become rich beyond their wildest dreams. You find yourself in a quieter, more formal setting, away from the boisterous pub. You are in the notary's office in Harlem. The air here is calm, hushed, filled with the scent of ink and parchment, but the transaction taking place is anything but ordinary. A man, a prominent and very wealthy merchant, is finalizing a deal. He is not buying a fleet of ships. He is not acquiring a vast tract of land. He is purchasing a single, smooth, brown tulip bulb. And the payment for this bulb is staggering. The documents being signed, with all the legal gravity of property deeds, confirm it. This man is trading a grand, multi-storied townhouse, complete with all its furnishings, located on a desirable canal in Amsterdam, for one single tulip bulb. This is the central, mainstream historical point at the absolute peak of Tulip Mania. The prices reach their most ludicrous extreme. There are numerous documented cases of rare tulip bulbs being exchanged for assets of immense value, houses, entire farms, significant quantities of livestock, and even industrial enterprises. The value of a single bulb like the legendary Semper Augustus was equivalent to the yearly income of dozens of skilled craftsmen, or the combined wealth of several prosperous families. It was not just an expensive item, it was a unit of account for unimaginable wealth. The stories of these absurd exchanges became the stuff of legend. Even at the time, beyond the townhouse, other documented transactions include a single bulb being traded for a brewery, or for enough grain to feed a small village for a year. People were literally exchanging tangible, income minus generating, life minus sustaining assets for a perishable, unplanted root. The perceived value of the tulip bulb had completely eclipsed its intrinsic worth, existing solely on the momentum of speculative belief. Why did people do this? The psychological element of the mania was overwhelming. It was not just greed. It was a collective delusion, a powerful social contagion. Everyone saw prices only going up. Every story reinforced the belief that investing in tulips was a guaranteed path to wealth. To not participate was to be left behind, to miss out on the greatest opportunity of a lifetime. The fear of missing out, or FOMO as we call it today, was a potent force, driving people to take increasingly irrational risks. This is our weirdly specific historical detail, the formal contracts themselves. Many of the most extravagant transactions, especially those involving properties, were not just handshake deals in a tavern. They were formally notarized agreements, recorded in official registers. This lends a strain, bureaucratic legitimacy to the absurdity. Imagine a modern lawyer drafting a contract for the sale of your home, and the agreed minus upon payment being a single, fancy flower. It's a testament to how deeply the speculative fervor had permeated every level of Dutch society, even its most sober legal institutions. This leads us to a fascinating and ongoing historical debate about the true nature of this peak. Was this trading of a house for a tulip bulb an isolated anomaly, a dramatic anecdote used to spice up the story, or was it truly representative of widespread, rational, high-minus stakes trade, even at these elevated levels? Some historians, often those arguing for the rationality of the bubble, suggest that these extreme examples were rare. They might have been staged for effect, or represented highly unusual circumstances between two extremely wealthy individuals who could afford such a gamble. They contend that the bulk of the market, even at its peak, was driven by less dramatic, though still inflated, prices for more common bulbs. However, the traditional view, supported by numerous contemporary accounts, emphasizes that while these peak transactions were rare, they were widely known and believed. They served as a powerful signal to the rest of the market, confirming that the sky was truly the limit. They provided a justification for everyone else to push prices just a little bit higher for their own, more modest bulbs. These extreme prices were the ultimate proof that the madness was real, and that the financial magic was working. They were the beacons that drew new, less sophisticated investors into the market, believing they too could achieve such dizzying heights. You stand in that notary's office, watching the ink dry on the parchment. The merchant's face is not triumphant, but calm, almost serene. He genuinely believes he has made a sound investment. He has exchanged a brick minus and minus mortar asset for something invisible, ephemeral, but in his mind, infinitely more valuable. He has traded security for the promise of limitless growth. He has climbed to the very pinnacle of this financial mountain, looking out at a world that seems to have no ceiling. As you look at the merchant, and then at the window, you see the grey light of winter. The dormant bulbs are still in the ground, sleeping, and a tiny, imperceptible crack appears in the perfect pane of glass, a hairline fracture in the collective belief. The market has climbed higher than any flower can reach, higher than any house can stand. And when something reaches such a dizzying height, the fall is often as swift as the ascent. The peak has been reached. The inevitable, though still unimaginable, descent is about to begin. The grand notary's office, with its ink-minus stained ledgers and weighty legal documents, fades into memory. The crisp, cold air of winter, which for months had been filled with the electric hum of speculative greed, now carries a different chill. It's February 1637, and you find yourself in the bustling city of Haarlem, another epicenter of the tulip trade. The usual scene of frantic bidding in the taverns is still present, but something is subtly, terrifyingly different. You are at a regular tulip auction, one of many held daily. It's not in a smoky pub this time, but in a more formal hall, set up by a group of florists. As the tulip dealers call themselves, the auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a jovial demeanor, stands on a small platform, holding up a tulip book open to a dazzling illustration. He announces the variety a beautiful Admiral leaf Kanchuke, famed for its purple and white flames. He quotes its last trading price, a truly breathtaking sum. He calls for bids. The room, usually a symphony of eager shouts on raised hands, is in a vacuum quiet. A few hesitant bids come in, far below the last recorded price. The auctioneer tries to cajole, to inspire, to whip up the usual frenzy. Gentlemen, this is a bargain, a masterpiece. Think of the profits. Who will offer more? Silence. He looks around, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He clears his throat, a sound that seems too loud in the sudden stillness. He tries again, desperately, for a lower price. Still nothing. The bids simply stop. No one wants to buy. This is the central, mainstream historical point. The collapse of Tulip Mania began not with a bang, but with a whimper. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic crash, but a gradual, almost imperceptible loss of confidence at a seemingly routine auction in Harlem on February 3, the moment someone tried to sell, and found no buyer willing to meet the ever-increasing prices. The illusion began to crack. The greater fool was nowhere to be found. The atmosphere in the room changes instantly. The buoyant optimism drains away, replaced by a palpable sense of unease. People avoid each other's eyes. Whispers replace shouts. The air thickens with a new, colder kind of energy doubt. The shared belief that had driven prices to impossible heights, the belief that there would always be someone willing to pay more, had just been broken. Here's a weirdly specific detail that highlights the absurdity of the timing. February is deep winter in the Netherlands. The ground is frozen. The bulbs are dormant. The tulips themselves won't bloom for another 2 or 3 months. The entire market, the vast fortunes being traded, was completely detached from the physical reality of the flower. It was a market for promises, for paper, for wind, and because there was no physical product to inspect, no fresh bloom to admire, the market stability was entirely dependent on pure, collective psychological momentum. When that momentum faltered, there was no tangible anchor to hold it steady. This leads to a persistent historical debate. What exactly triggered that first moment of hesitation? Was it purely psychological, a collective fatigue with the ever-escalating prices? A moment when one too many people quietly decided the risk was too great? Or was there a specific, external catalyst? Some historians argue it was simply an inevitable tipping point in a classic speculative bubble. The prices had become so stratospheric that the pool of greater fools willing to buy was finally exhausted. The market had outrun its own oxygen supply. Other theories suggest more concrete causes. Some point to a minor outbreak of the bubonic plague in Harlem around that time, which might have led some wealthy individuals to flee the city, disrupting their trading and dampening spirits. Others suggest that the Dutch government was considering new regulations on futures contracts, which might have made some investors nervous and hesitant to buy. There's also the idea that professional traders, sensing the top of the market, simply decided to pull out first, strategically selling their holdings, which then spooked the less experienced traders. The exact spark remains a matter of historical contention. You feel a knot tighten in your stomach. You had believed it. Tale. You had watched your hypothetical weaver friend invest his life savings, and you had thought, perhaps, that he was brilliant. Now, you see the panic in the eyes of the auctioneer, and you know, with chilling certainty, that the spell has been broken. A man tries to sell a contract for a Semper Augustus, a bulb that was recently worth a grand house. He starts calling out prices, lower and lower, desperately. No one meets them. The silence in the room is terrifying, a vacuum where collective confidence used to be. The prices are plummeting faster than they rose. People who bought just yesterday, convinced they were getting a bargain, are now looking at ruin. You slip out of the auction hall, the low murmur of desperate voices following you into the cold Harlem air. The canal houses still stand, solid and serene, but the invisible value, the fantastical wealth that had made the Dutch Golden Age even brighter, is now evaporated. The tulip, once a symbol of impossible wealth, is rapidly reverting to its true nature of pretty, but ultimately worthless. Flower, the party is over, and for thousands of people, the hangover is going to be brutal. The cold air outside the Harlem auction hall does little to dispel the dread building in your stomach. The silence that fell over that room, the sudden refusal to buy, was a poison, and it's already spreading. You walk quickly, almost running, past the gabled houses, but you can feel it in the air, a shift in the collective mood of the city. The exhilarating buzz of speculation has been replaced by a low, anxious hum. You decide to head back to one of the taverns, one of the colleague IES where the wind trade had flourished. You push open the heavy wooden door, and the scene inside is dramatically different from just days ago. The pipe smoke is still thick, the air still smells of stale beer, but the boisterous laughter and excited shouts are gone. They've been replaced by a cacophony of frantic, desperate voices. The room is no longer a celebration of easy money. It's a marketplace of fear. Men who were buying eagerly yesterday are now trying to sell. Their faces pale, their eyes wide with panic. They shout out prices for their tulip contracts, lower and lower, desperately trying to find a buyer. But there are almost no buyers. Everyone is selling. Everyone is trying to get out. This is the central, mainstream historical point. The initial dip in confidence quickly cascaded into a full minus blow. Contagious panic, the speculative bubble, which had inflated on the hot air of collective optimism, was now deflating at terrifying speed. Yesaya Weaver, perhaps the same one you saw just days ago, his face contorted in agony, HES clutching a piece of paper, a contract for a General bulb that he bought at an inflated price just last week. HES shouting, 500 guilders. It'll take 500. Yesterday, it might have been worth 500. Eamon next to him just shakes his head, walking away. The weaver's train, bought with his life savings, is turning to dust before his eyes. The psychological contagion is palpable. Panic, like a plague, sweeps through the room. One man drops his contract, unable to look at it anymore, and stumbles out the door. Another furiously demands that the merchant who sold him a contract honor the wine money deposit. But the merchant just throws his hands up in despair. The system of informal trust that underpinned the wind trade is collapsing. And this brings us to a weirdly specific and incredibly painful detail of how this collapse hit the common man. Remember the wage coup or wine money system? The small, minus refundable deposit paid at the time of the contract signing, often used to buy a round of drinks. It was meant to bind the deal, but now it became a source of immense legal and financial chaos. Buyers who had paid their 2.5% deposit, hoping to flip the contract for a profit, were suddenly faced with the prospect of having to pay the full, ruinously high price for a bulb that was now worth a fraction of that amount. They couldn't walk away without losing their deposit, but paying the full price would mean financial ruin. Sellers, meanwhile, were facing the nightmare of holding contracts for bulbs that no one would buy. They were legally obligated to deliver these bulbs in May, but the market price had crashed, meaning they would take a colossal loss. The wine money was meant to lubricate the market, but now it was choking it, creating a web of unenforceable debts and broken promises. This leads to a fierce historical debate about the true social and economic impact of the crash. The traditional view, still widely popular, leans heavily on Charles Mackay's dramatic accounts. He painted a picture of widespread national ruin, with thousands of families utterly devastated, fortunes lost overnight, and the Dutch economy crippled. He described a moralistic fall, where greed met its inevitable, brutal punishment. This view emphasizes the psychological irrationality of the masses. However, as we've discussed, more recent historical research, particularly by economic historians like Peter Garbrand and Goldgar, challenges this extreme view. They argue that the impact was far less widespread and devastating than traditionally portrayed. They point out that, first, limited participants, the number of people involved in the highest minus-stakes wind trade was actually quite small, primarily wealthy merchants who could absorb significant losses. Second, informal contracts, because many of the contracts were informal and not legally binding. A lot of the promised money simply never changed hands. Many contracts were simply abandoned or renegotiated, often for pennies on the guilder, rather than fully paid out. People just walked away from their debts. Third, economic resilience. The overall Dutch economy was incredibly strong at the time. Tulip Mania was a relatively small speculative niche within a much larger, robust global trading empire. While some individuals lost fortunes, the crash didn't trigger a widespread economic depression or a collapse of the Dutch financial system. The economy simply shrugged it off and kept going. So was it a truly devastating national calamity, or a highly dramatic but ultimately contained episode of irrational exuberance among a subset of the wealthy? The debate continues. You slip out of the tavern, the cries of desperate men fading behind you. The feeling of intoxicating collective optimism has been replaced by cold, hard fear. The dream of easy riches has turned into a nightmare of debt and ruin. The tulip, once a symbol of boundless possibility, is now a symbol of folly. The market has crashed, and the real minus world consequences, messy and painful, are just beginning to unfold. The government, which had largely ignored the wild speculation, will now be forced to step in, desperately trying to pick up the pieces of a broken market and a shattered confidence. The frantic echoes of the panicked taverns cling to you as you walk through the silent, cold streets. The air is thick with a different kind of anxiety now. Not just the individual terror of losing a fortune, but a broader, societal unease. The public mood has shifted from giddy excitement to bitter recrimination. Everyone wants to know who is to blame. Everyone wants to know who is going to fix this monumental mess. And the gaze of the ruined, the desperate, and the simply bewildered now turns to the men in charge. You find yourself in the bustling chambers of the Dutch government, perhaps in the city hall of Haarlem or Amsterdam. It's no longer just the town magistrates dealing with isolated cases. The powerful city councils, composed of the wealthiest and most influential merchants and regents, are now meeting in emergency sessions. The air is tense, filled with the scratching of quills and the low, urgent murmur of worried men. They are trying to find a solution to an unprecedented problem. A financial market has completely collapsed, leaving behind a tangled web of unenforceable contracts, broken promises, and deeply aggrieved citizens. This is the central, mainstream historical point. The collapse of Tulip Mania forced the Dutch authorities to intervene. Grappling with a financial crisis they had no legal or economic framework to understand, let alone resolve. They had largely ignored the speculative frenzy while it was making everyone rich on paper, but now that it was causing widespread ruin and social unrest, they had no choice but to step in. The problem they faced was immense. Thousands of people, from the wealthiest merchants to the humblest artisans, held contracts for bulbs that were now worth a tiny fraction of their agreed minus upon price. If the original buyers were forced to pay the full, inflated price, they would be utterly ruined. But if the sellers were simply left with worthless contracts, they too would face massive losses, and the entire system of commercial trust could unravel. The legal precedent for such a situation simply didn't exist. Was a futures contract for a tulip bulb a legally binding sale, a gambling debt, or something else entirely? The initial response from the authorities was a mixture of confusion and frustration. They understood that the situation was unsustainable, but they were reluctant to interfere too much with the principles of free trade and contracts. After much deliberation and desperate pleas from the trading community, they issued a series of decrees aimed at mitigating the damage. The most significant of these decrees, issued in February and April of 1637, attempted to bring some order to the chaos. The main proposal was to allow buyers to walk away from their contracts by paying a small penalty fee, typically 3.5% of the original contract price. This was a form of renegotiation, an attempt to make the losses less catastrophic for the buyers, while giving the sellers some compensation, however meager. Here's a weirdly specific and slightly ironic detail about these decrees. The government officially ruled that these tulip contracts were to be treated as gambling debts. This was a crucial legal distinction. In Dutch law, gambling debts were not fully enforceable in court. This meant that the government was essentially saying, yes, These contracts exist, but no, we're not going to force people to pay ruinous amounts for what was essentially a game of chance. It was a pragmatic way to diffuse the immediate crisis without completely overturning the principles of contract law. But it also retroactively stripped the entire market of its legitimacy as a serious commercial venture. The tulip trade was reclassified from a legitimate investment to a mere roll of the dice. This leads to a deepened ongoing historical debate. Did the government's intervention save the Dutch economy, or did it merely paper over the cracks? One school of thought argues that the government's actions were a vital, albeit imperfect, response that prevented widespread financial collapse. By allowing buyers to pay a reduced penalty and walk away, they prevented mass bankruptcies and social unrest. This view sees the Dutch authorities as nimble and pragmatic, willing to adapt their legal framework to an unprecedented economic event. They limited the damage and allowed the fundamentally strong Dutch economy to quickly recover. However, another perspective suggests that the government's actions were too little, too late, and ultimately ineffective. They argue that the market had already crashed before the decrees were issued, and that many contracts were simply abandoned anyway, regardless of the official rulings. They also point out that the legal ambiguity created by classifying contracts as gambling debts led 2 years of lingering lawsuits and disputes that continued to plague the Dutch courts. The government's intervention, in this view, was more about managing the optics of a crisis than genuinely fixing a broken financial system. The mess, they argue, was far too big to be neatly solved by a few legal pronouncements. You sit in the government chamber, listening to the dry, agonistic language of the decrees. You understand that behind these formal words are thousands of shattered dreams, of families facing hardship, and of a collective sense of betrayal. The men in this room are not discussing flowers. They are discussing the very fabric of society. They are trying to stitch it back together after it has been torn apart by an invisible force of collective desire and delusion. The outcome of their efforts is mixed. While the immediate financial panic subsides, the hangover from Tulip Mania lingers for years. Many smaller traders are indeed ruined. Trust in speculative markets is severely eroded. The image of the tulip as a symbol of prosperity is tarnished, but the fundamental strength of the Dutch economy, built on its vast global trade and financial institutions, ultimately allows it to weather the storm. The tulip bubble was a painful lesson, but not a fatal one. The government, in its clumsy, bureaucratic way, had tried to tidy up a mess born of irrational exuberance, but the underlying questions about human greed and the nature of value would continue to fascinate, and occasionally torment, future generations. The formal council chambers fade, leaving behind the lingering scent of parchment and the echoes of legal pronouncements. The immediate crisis of the tulip market has passed, but the story of what really happened, and how devastating it truly was, has just begun. You are now floating above the centuries, observing historians, economists, and writers they grapple with the legacy of Tulip Mania. The air is no longer thick with panic, but with intellectual debate, the gentle rustle of academic papers, and the occasional raised voice in a university lecture hall. This is the central, mainstream historical debate. Was Tulip Mania a widespread national calamity that crippled the Dutch economy and ruined thousands of ordinary people, or has its severity been greatly exaggerated, turning it into more of a myth than a mania in the popular imagination? For a very long time, the traditional narrative of Tulip Mania was dominated by the dramatic accounts of the 19th-century Scottish journalist Charles Mackay. His book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, published in 1841, became the definitive source. Mackay painted a vivid, almost sensationalist picture of the mania. He described an entire nation losing its collective mind, from aristocrats to chimney sweeps, abandoning their trades, selling their properties, and sinking every last penny into tulip bulbs. He wrote of widespread ruin, mass bankruptcies, and a total collapse of faith in speculative markets, followed by years of despair. Mackay's narrative is compelling because it appeals to a deep human need for a moralizing tale. It's a story about the dangers of irrational exuberance, the folly of greed, and the inevitable punishment for those who deviate from honest labor. It became the archetypal example of a speculative bubble, cited countless times in economics textbooks and popular articles whenever financial markets go wild. If you've heard anything about Tulip Mania before today, it's almost certainly McKay's version. But then, as always in history, new research emerged. In the late 20th century, particularly in the 1980s until 1990s, a group of economic historians, notably Peter Garbrand and Gold Gar, began to meticulously examine the original Dutch archives, notary records, court documents, merchant ledgers, and auction lists, and what they found challenged McKay's dramatic account in fundamental ways. This is where the revisionist perspective comes in, arguing that the mania was more of a myth in terms of its overall economic and social impact. Their arguments are compelling. First, limited participation. Gold Gar, in her groundbreaking book Tulip Mania, Money, Honor, and Knowledge in the Dutch Golden Age, found that the number of people directly involved in the highest minus stakes tulip trade was relatively small. It was primarily a market for wealthy merchants, professional growers, and a limited number of high minus status artisans. She found little evidence of widespread participation by the vast majority of ordinary Dutch citizens, the maids, chimney sweeps, and farmers McKay so vividly described. Second, informal contracts, as we touched upon. Many of the famous futures contracts were not legally binding in the same way a modern stock transaction is. They were often informal, based on personal honor and a 2.5% wine money deposit. When the market crashed, many buyers simply walked away from these contracts, forfeiting their small deposit but avoiding catastrophic ruin. There wasn't a universal legal obligation to pay the full, inflated price for now minus worthless bulbs. Third, no systemic economic impact. The Dutch Republic was an incredibly wealthy and robust trading nation at the time. Its economy was diversified, based on global trade, shipping, finance, and manufacturing. The total amount of money involved in the tulip market, while significant for individuals, was a mere fraction of the overall national wealth. The crash of the tulip market, these historians argue, did not cause a widespread economic depression. The Dutch economy shrugged it off and continued its golden age for decades. So, the debate rages. Was McKay's account an honest but ultimately flawed interpretation based on limited sources and a taste for drama? Or was it a deliberate exaggeration, a cautionary tale crafted to serve a moral purpose for his 19th-century audience? Warning against the dangers of speculation in an era of industrial growth. Historians still debate this question vigorously. The truth, as often happens, lies somewhere in the nuanced middle. It was certainly a mania for those directly involved, causing real and painful losses for many individuals and families. But it was likely not the economy minus crippling, society minus shattering event that popular history often portrays. Here's a quirky, almost cold detail from the revisionist viewpoint. The biggest financial loss was often experienced by the tulip sellers, the professional growers and big merchants who were left holding the now minus worthless bulbs that no one would buy, or contracts that buyers had defaulted on. The buyers, who simply walked away from their debts, often got off relatively lightly, only losing their small deposits. So, the story of widespread ruin among the greater fools might be inverted. The fools were actually the ones who had been too smart to sell their highly valued bulbs, believing the prices would rise forever. You observe these historical debates, the careful analysis of dusty ledgers and ancient court documents. The tulip, once an object of absurd value, has now become an object of academic scrutiny. Its story is no longer about beauty or greed, but about the nature of bubbles, the power of collective belief, and the ongoing challenge of understanding the past without projecting our own anxieties onto it. The mania has been dissected, analyzed, and, for some, effectively diffused, but the tulip itself, stripped of its insane monetary value, still remains, and its enduring presence in Dutch culture is the final, most peaceful chapter of its story. The academic debates and the dry analysis of historical documents fade, replaced by a sense of calm resilience. The financial frenzy of Tulip Mania is long over. A tumultuous chapter closed, but the tulip itself, stripped of its absurd monetary value, has not disappeared. Quite the opposite. It has, perhaps ironically, found its true and lasting place in Dutch culture. You are now in the Netherlands, a few decades after the crash. The initial shock and bitterness have subsided. The legal disputes have mostly been settled, or abandoned. The memories of ruin are still raw for some, but for the most part, life has moved on. The Dutch economy, robust and diversified, has continued to prosper, and the tulip, it's still everywhere. This is the central, mainstream historical point after the bubble burst. The tulip transitioned from a speculator's gamble into a beloved and enduring national symbol. It stopped being an investment vehicle and reverted to being what it always was meant to be, a beautiful flower. The growers, who had always loved their flowers, continued to cultivate them. The artists, who were captivated by their beauty, continued to paint them. And the Dutch people, having endured the madness, rediscovered a quieter, more stable appreciation for the flower itself. You see it in the gardens. People are still planting tulips, but now they are doing so for aesthetic pleasure, not for financial gain. The meticulously curated beds of individual, highly valuable bulbs have given way to broader displays of vibrant color. The tulip is no longer a solitary jewel. It's part of a beautiful, harmonious ensemble. You see it in the art. Tulips still minus lives continue to be painted, but the moralizing vanitas elements become less prominent. The focus shifts to pure botanical beauty, to the celebration of nature's artistry. The paintings reflect a newfound, unburdened joy in the flower's form and color, free from the dark shadow of speculative greed. And you see it in the everyday life of the Dutch. The tulip, with its exotic origins and its history of drama, becomes woven into the national identity. It represents resilience, the ability to turn something foreign into something uniquely Dutch. It embodies a kind of quiet pride in their horticultural skill, in their ability to cultivate beauty from the land they have literally wrestled from the sea. Here's a wonderfully specific detail that highlights this enduring love: the annual Bloem and Corso, or flower parade. While these elaborate parades with floats decorated entirely in flowers didn't officially start until the early 20th century, their roots can be traced back to this post-Mania period of renewed appreciation. The Dutch began to organize smaller, informal flower shows and displays, celebrating their horticultural prowess and the sheer joy of their blooms. The tulip became a source of collective pride, not individual profit. This leads to a fascinating historical debate. Was the tulip's transition from craze to culture like an unconscious act of rebranding, an effort by the Dutch to reclaim a symbol that had been tarnished by speculative excess? Or was it a more organic, emotional process, a return to genuine affection after the financial fever broke? Some historians argue that there was an element of deliberate cultural cleansing. The memory of the mania was embarrassing, a stain on the sober, rational image the Dutch wanted to project. Establishing the tulip as a symbol of beauty and national pride, rather than financial folly, was a way to move on, to heal the collective trauma. However, others argue that the tulip's appeal was simply too strong, its beauty too compelling, for it to be abandoned. The crash exposed the absurdity of the prices, but it didn't diminish the flower. People continued to love tulips simply because they were beautiful. The cultural significance endured because the aesthetic appreciation was genuine and deeper than any fleeting market valuation. You walk through a tranquil Dutch garden, the scent of spring flowers filling the air. There are tulips everywhere, in every imaginable color and pattern, their elegant cups unfurling in the gentle sunlight. They are beautiful, yes, but they no longer whisper promises of untold wealth. Instead, they speak of patience, of natural cycles, and of an enduring, quiet beauty. The madness is gone, the calm remains, and the stage is set for the final, most glorious manifestation of this enduring love, the vast, breathtaking fields of color that would come to define the Netherlands for centuries to come. The individual gardens and quaint village scenes of the post-Pointless Mania era finally give way to something immense, something truly breathtaking. You are now hovering high above the Netherlands, looking down on a landscape transformed. It is spring, and beneath you stretches an endless, impossible tapestry of color, row after row, field after field, of blooming tulips, stretching as far as the eye can see, like giant, meticulously painted stripes on the earth. Red, yellow, purple, pink, orange, a vibrant, living kaleidoscope. This is the modern face of the Dutch tulip industry, a testament to centuries of cultivation, tradition, and a deeply ingrained national identity. This is the central, mainstream reality of the tulip today. It is no longer a symbol of speculative madness, but a global agricultural powerhouse and an iconic emblem of the Netherlands. The industry is vast and sophisticated, focused on efficient production, scientific breeding, and worldwide export. The era of trading single, wildly overpriced bulbs is a distant memory. Today, millions of bulbs are produced and shipped annually, destined for gardens and florists around the globe. You descend into one of these fields. The air here is cool and moist, carrying the faint, sweet scent of a million blooms. The sheer scale is overwhelming. It is a testament to the Dutch mastery of horticulture, their ability to tame and order nature on an industrial scale. This is a far cry from careless Clausius's small, secret garden, or the guarded dry cabinets of the wealthy merchants. The tulip has been democratized, mass produced, and made accessible to everyone. Here's a weirdly specific detail that highlights this shift. The modern tulip industry has nearly eradicated the very virus that caused the famous broken patterns of Tulip Mania. Today's growers strive for pure, unblemished colors. A broken tulip in a commercial field would be a sign of disease, not value, and would be quickly discarded. If you want to see a broken tulip today, you'll likely have to find a specialty heritage grower or visit a specific display garden. The very thing that sparked the mania is now an undesirable trait in modern cultivation. The virus, it seems, caused the boom and then was almost entirely wiped out by the very industry it helped to create. This leads to a fascinating ongoing historical debate: is the modern tulip industry a direct, unbroken legacy of Tulip Mania, or is it a completely separate phenomenon? One perspective argues for continuity. They see the mania, despite its excesses, as having solidified the Netherlands' reputation as the center of tulip cultivation. The investment in infrastructure, knowledge, and growing techniques during the boom, however irrational, laid the groundwork for the efficient industry that followed. The crash was a blip, a growing pain, but the underlying passion and horticultural expertise continued. However, another perspective argues for a cleaner break. They contend that the modern industry is driven by very different economic forces: efficiency, scale, and global demand for cut flowers and garden bulbs, not by speculative rarity. The cultural memory of the mania may give the industry a romantic backstory, but the actual business is based on sober, rational agricultural principles, not irrational exuberance. The modern industry, in this view, developed despite the mania, not because of it. You walk slowly through the rows of perfect, vibrant blooms. A faint hum of distant farm machinery is the only sound, a stark contrast to the clamor of the old trading taverns. The tulip, this unassuming little bulb from a distant land, has seen it all. It has been an object of academic curiosity, a symbol of extreme wealth, a cause of financial ruin, and finally, a beloved national icon. Its journey is a testament to human obsession, to the power of beauty, and to the strange, unpredictable ways that value can be created and destroyed. You reach the end of a long row of deep red tulips. You reach out and gently touch a velvety petal. It feels soft, ephemeral, and perfectly real, no longer loaded with impossible financial weight. It is simply beautiful, and in that simple beauty, you find a quiet peace. The story of its crazy, complicated past has brought you to this place of calm, colorful tranquility. The sun is setting now, casting long, deep shadows across the vast, colorful field. The vibrant hues of the tulips soften into pastel shades of orange and purple, blending seamlessly into the horizon. The distant hum of machinery finally falls silent, and a profound calm descends over the landscape. The day's work is done, and the air is filled only with the faint, sweet scent of a million blooming flowers. You lie back, perhaps imagining yourself floating above these fields, suspended in a gentle, warm current. The whirlwind of history, the frantic shouts of traders, the anxious whispers of fortunes lost, it all drifts away, like wisps of smoke on the evening breeze. There is only the quiet breathing of the night, the peaceful, endless expanse of color below, and the feeling of soft, dream-like relaxation. Your mind is no longer racing with facts and figures, but slowing, softening, becoming light. The weight